Hello and welcome to this special video. We are bringing together all of the best content from 2016 that we have yet to put out. And one of the best talks that we had was from Charles Eisenstein at our Future of Functional event in Utah. Charles is an author and speaker and talked to us about the shift in medicine from the old story to the new story. Amazing watching. I hope you enjoy, and I'd love to see your comments below.
Yeah, don't you have this feeling when you immerse yourself in the system as it's been handed to us that it's not supposed to be this way, and it could be better? And sometimes you get a glimpse of how it could be. It might be just an interaction with a patient or some experience that seems like it's not just a temporary excursion from normality, but it feels like a promise of what could be. And when you have an experience like that, or perhaps it's through some kind of healing event for yourself or through functional medicine, and you have an experience that violates normal, you cannot abide in normal anymore. Normal doesn't seem very normal, and real doesn't seem very real anymore. And James was saying that I'm not going to, he's going to have a talk that's not about medicine at all, but actually it is going to be about medicine, even though I know almost nothing about functional medicine. I'm not even quite sure what it is, actually, but maybe nonetheless some things will be relevant. I've got to tell this story. Kelly, I think I told it to you already, but forgive me for that. Speaking of seemingly irrelevant, so I know this guy. His name's actually Guy Lieberman. He's like this kind of journalist kind of guy in South Africa, and he's a solid dude, but you wouldn't mistake him for a guru or anything that special. But he told me this story about when he was a young man backpacking through Africa, the Middle East, and having his adventures, early 20s. Some of you may have done this as well. And he fell in with an actual spiritual teacher, guru kind of guy who had a huge following centered around his main teaching, which was that the ascension was going to happen in the year 1995 on a specific date. And none of this would be relevant because we would all be restored to youthfulness and perfect health. Our fillings would pop out and everything would be great. And maybe UFOs would land. And it was like this guy was a compelling, charismatic teacher, and Guy Lieberman fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, and became a devotee and got to know people in his inner circle, and was told by one of these people that you are destined to go next to Zimbabwe. So he asks the guru, is that okay with you? And he says, yes, that's a good idea. And while you're there, if you have a chance to spread the word, here are some 3-ring binders with my teachings, if you have a chance. And here's a phone number of somebody I know there, an address, she'll take care of you. So he shows up in Harar and is greeted like a king, like a VIP. And he doesn't really know why. He doesn't know, but the spiritual guru has told the woman and the whole community there that he is a hidden master, an enlightened avatar in the form of a 21-year-old backpacker. But he doesn't know that they've been told this, so he'll be like having dinner with them, and he'll be like, wow, this is good soup. And a hush will fall, and everyone starts eating really mindfully, Is it something I said? And so one day they put him up on stage, and they say, okay, Guy Lieberman will now teach us to meditate, lead us in meditation. And here he is in front of hundreds of people, all of a sudden up on stage. And he says, but I don't know how to meditate. And everyone is like, oh, such humility. Already such a beautiful teaching from this young man. Can you believe it? And he sees this and he says, no, you don't understand. I really don't know how to meditate. Oh, it's not about knowing how. It's not about expertise. And it's a profound teaching. And people are coming up to him afterwards, and it's good meditation, People are coming up to him and asking him questions, and he's thumbing through the 3-ring binders, but everything he says is received as a pearl of wisdom. I feel a little bit like that right now after that introduction. So, like, believe me when I say I do not know anything about functional medicine. So, but I do know maybe something about transition in personal life and the transition of systems and civilizations. And I think that it's pretty clear that we're in the midst of such a transition right now. When Russ was speaking about the trajectory of American healthcare spending from 6% to 18%, I was reminded of the thesis of the historian Joseph Tainter, who made a comprehensive survey of every civilization that's ever existed on Earth and identified a common factor in the collapse of these civilizations. I think the book is called The Collapse of Complex Societies. It's a very academic book, but what he identified as a common feature in every single one of them was decreasing marginal returns on investments in complexity, if that makes sense. In other words, the first investment in complexity works great. The first investments in healthcare brought enormous results. 26-year increase in lifespan from the year 1900 to 1950. But then further investments in complexity bring smaller and smaller results until in the end, you have to devote endless amounts of money even to keep things the same. So we saw perhaps an 8 or 9 year increase in life expectancy in the second half of the 20th century. And it wasn't because we weren't spending as much money on it. And now we're seeing declines in life expectancy. So it fits this general pattern, and the crisis in medicine does not stand alone among the institutions of our society. The same crisis with the same pattern exists in every system, in education, in politics, in the economic system, the money system, and then of course you can look at the mother of all crises, the ecological crisis. And I think that many of us have a feeling, an intuition, that all of these crises are interrelated, and that on some level, I'm speaking pretending that I'm involved in functional medicine, we are working on the same mission as the person who's trying to restore wetlands or stop the destruction of mangroves or bring restorative justice practices to the criminal punishment system or working in holistic education. We kind of sense a kinship or an alliance here. But what is that thing? They seem so unrelated. But all of these efforts are born of the same fundamental crisis that visits each institution in a different way. And they are all also drawing from the next. So now I'm going to introduce the concept of story here, which is another thing that Russ mentioned. But they're drawing from a new story, or I like to call it a new and ancient story, because it really isn't a new story. It's something that we are rediscovering, revalidating, and bringing into a new context, because it has never before operated in a mass society. That's what's new about it. But the story itself isn't new. And so all of these efforts are drawing from and contributing to this new story. James mentioned it, the story of interconnection, of, I like to call it, use Thich Nhat Hanh's term, interbeing. Because it's not just separate beings that realize that we're connected, that realize that our well-being is conditionally dependent on the well-being of the rainforest, or the well-being of the microbiome, or the well-being of other people on this planet. But it's not a conditional dependence, it's an existential dependence, where we understand that what's happening in this world, what's happening to every being on this planet is happening to us. And that we cannot, as Tom, I believe, somebody was saying, was it you, like putting rims around, to keep the poor out, to keep the problems out, to put an insulating shell around yourself that says that what's happening to the oceans, what's happening to the forests, that needn't affect me because I'm wealthy enough to buy my supplements from whatever pristine places exist on this planet, and I can insulate myself from the harm that is being done to the other if I can only build a strong enough fortress to keep out the other, to insulate myself from the effects of what I or we as a society have done to the world. And we're beginning to understand that that's impossible because we are existentially bound to all beings. And I will actually get to how this interfaces with the revolution in medicine that's happening. But we are existentially bound. This is a relationship that we can feel. When you read about the last 6 white rhinos or dying in zoos, or you see the pictures of the dead seabirds with their stomachs full of plastic and their feathers coated with oil, and it's painful, you know? Why is that? Is it because you're making some implicit self-interested calculation that this is going to impact your reproductive self-interest or your economic self-interest? No. It's because it hurts, because it's happening to you. And when we disconnect from the source of that pain, all we know is that it hurts. It hurts just to be. And that's considered a normal state, which is why we have such a thing as boredom. Boredom is the feeling of it hurts just to be. So we seek to fill it up or to medicate it. To medicate, this is what I think connects me with Kelly's work, you know, and why we have this feeling of alliance too. This pain, which is supposed to push us out of an intolerable situation, is seen as a problem to be medicated. Anyway, that's a whole other rabbit trail. But so the story that we're moving out of through a process of crisis, which is really kind of a birth crisis here, is what I call the story of separation. And we've had some allusions to it already. Russ mentioned, you know, the Cartesian reductionism. But yeah, so the story of separation. So these stories, okay, the world is built on a story, a mythology. Every culture has one that tells us what's real, who we are, what's important, how to live life, how to be a man, how to be a woman, how change happens in the world. It includes a theory of change. And then it spins off all these subsidiary stories about that define politics, law, medicine. Here's how to deal with disease. And we can see in a minute, I'll reference it and it'll be obvious to everybody in this room. We can see how the dominant medical paradigm, which is becoming obsolete as the foundational story becomes obsolete, but we can see how it draws on the story of separation, which says, here's how it answers these questions. It says, who you are is a discrete, separate individual in a world of other, in an objective universe that's separate from yourself. The description of this, and the universe outside yourself is basically a thing. It doesn't possess the qualities of a self. It's a bunch of generic particles that bounce around in this melee of force, deterministic forces, or if you try to accommodate quantum mechanics in this worldview, it's acausal random forces. Anyway, a bunch of stuff out there. Therefore, for the separate self to enjoy well-being and to make progress, you have to exercise control over this external, hostile, or at least indifferent world, and insulate yourself from these forces out there. Therefore, part of the story is, I call it the ascent of humanity, which says that human progress comes through, the human story is this kind of triumphant progress in the amount of control that we're able to exercise over the world. Thanks to technology and science, we started out as helpless, superstitious animals, barely struggling to survive, and then thanks to technology, we became gradually the lords and masters, a Cartesian reference again, of nature. And the future is going to be a paradise of complete control where we extend our domination of the world to the molecular level, the genetic level, into outer space, and so on and so forth. Now, if I had more time, I might go into some of the anthropological counter evidence that life was ever nasty, brutish, and short, and a struggle to survive. It was actually way, way more affluent than almost anybody experiences today. I mean, this is like widely established anthropological fact, but I won't go there any more than I already have. So, different disciplines characterize the separate self in different ways. For example, spirituality or religion, you have the separate soul encased in flesh. Psychology, you have this kind of bubble of consciousness. And there's another bubble of consciousness, and there's another one. Philosophy, you have the mote of consciousness, the Cartesian mote of awareness in a machine made of flesh. Biology, the separate self takes the form of really the nuclear DNA that seeks to maximize reproductive self-interest. And this is breaking down in every one of these realms. Economics, the economic man seeking to maximize rational self-interest. This is breaking down in every realm. Russ mentioned epigenetics. Why was that so revolutionary and so challenging, and why did it provoke such a vitriolic response from the holders of the orthodoxy? They sense that it erodes the deep foundation of the dominant worldview, because it calls into question the integrity and the separateness of this genetic self. And it's not just epigenetics, it's also, I'm sure most of you know that cells and organisms can re-engineer their own DNA and pass not just the epigenetic changes, but the genetic changes into the germline. There's a book by James Shapiro that's amazing about this, Evolution View from the 21st Century, it's called. Anyway, so like this self is fluid, and then you get into horizontal gene transfer and like this, we're not these, even on the genetic level, we're not these separate selves. And so in every, and I could go on, in every area of science, philosophy, economics, politics even, spirituality, of course, as well, the ideology of separation is breaking down. And everything built on it is breaking down as well. The breakdown is coming through, I would say, a push and a pull. The push is the birth contractions of the breakdown of all of our institutions, all of these converging crises that have been referenced. And the pull, as the shell of the world cracks, we see the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. We see glimpses of a new story. And it's so attractive to us. It calls to us. And we want to serve the emergence of that story. And I think perhaps that's why we're all here together. We're all here in some kind of service, and we're all here because something happened to you to expel you from the old story. And maybe it's not a complete expulsion. I know it's not for me. I discover almost daily aspects of the story of separation that still live within me. For example, envy, which is based on scarcity, which says that what's good for you can't be good for me, because in a world of separation, if we're separate selves in an objective universe, then more for you is less for me. This is contrary to the perceptions of an interbeing, because if you're part of me and I'm part of you, and the well-being of the rainforest or the soil or the water is essential to my well-being, then what's good for the soil is good for me. What's good for the rainforest is good for me. What's good for society, what's good for you will be good for me. We live in a system that denies that truth and makes it untrue, because we live in a society of artificial scarcity. I once made a list of like 19 forms of artificial scarcity that exists in our society, like scarcity of food, artificial. Like we waste way more than enough food to feed everybody in the world. Not to mention that the largest irrigated crop is lawn grass. I mean, we could grow so much more food. Scarcity of money, scarcity of love, sex, intimacy, scarcity of beauty, just like the oppressive ugliness of the built environment. When I was in New York last time, I was like, I arrived in Grand Central Station, and as recently as whenever, like 90 years ago, whenever it was built, like there was another priority besides efficiency. It is unnecessarily beautiful. And I look around at the built environment, the strip malls and the Walmarts, and I'm like, can't we do better than this? Like 5,000 years of architecture, and this is what we've got? My soul rebels against it. And this is one of the things that I'm just like, this can't be right. This can't be right. So maybe I'll say a little bit about one more aspect of the old story and the new story. I just mentioned it before, that the story of separation denies the qualities of self or beingness or intelligence to the world outside of ourselves. If you take that for granted, if you take for granted that the universe and life is kind of an accidental collision of molecules, then, and that has no natural organic tendency toward order or toward organization, and in fact has the opposite tendency, an entropic tendency that is seemingly implied by the second law of thermodynamics. If you take that for granted, then we're always on the verge of extinction, and we always need to impose the intelligence that's lacking onto the world. Now, can you see how this translates into traditional allopathic medicine? The body is this happenstantial machine that falls apart all the time, doesn't know what it's doing, and so you need to impose order. You need to impose the intelligence of the doctor onto the patient, aptly named, because the patient is a passive receiver of healing. And can you see how functional medicine, in a couple ways that I've heard here today, is drawing on a different story that accords to the body an inherent organic intelligence and seeks to create conditions for that intelligence to operate. That the body has an inherent will or movement toward wholeness. And the goal of the doctor then is to remove the obstacles toward that move toward wholeness. So that is one of the ways that the story of interbeing that does not sequester intelligence and full subjectivity in the human mind, but sees it everywhere. That's one way that it affects medical thinking, and that's part of the transition that we're going through. Now, the medical system is embedded in all of our other systems, and the system that has been coming up in conversations here there's two. One would be the economic system, and one would be the political system. So a medical paradigm that draws from a new story, that draws from a story of interbeing, that draws from a mythology, because that's what it really is, a mythology that accords life and beingness to all things, and even to substances, and say there's an intelligence in this substance. And I know that for every condition, there's a corresponding reflection in the universe, because the inner mirrors the outer, because we are interbeings, right? So I'm going to find that thing, because I know it exists. I mean, that's one way to understand homeopathy, for example, that every internal condition is mirrored by a substance. And all of these, every alternative paradigm, modality, draws in some way from the inner beingness and organic intelligence of the entire world, the entire cosmos even. So a system drawing from that story is going to fit very unhappily into the dominant the dominant political and economic system, because the dominant political and economic systems are built part and parcel on the story of separation. The economic system, for example, is predicated on separate competing selves. It's predicated on scarcity. In fact, our money system has scarcity built into it because of the way money is created. It's a design feature. So when you say money is just energy, and if I am in a state of abundance, a mentality of abundance, then abundance will come to me because it's just energy, and energy flows where attention goes, yada, yada, yada. There's a problem with that way of thinking. I mean, for one thing, are you going to say to the impoverished village in Bangladesh that they're just mired in scarcity mentality, unlike me, the white person here in this beautiful place? No, we know better than that, But yeah, the way that money is created has scarcity built into it because it's created as interest-bearing debt, which comes into this is a whole other lecture. But one sentence, or is this okay? Am I doing all right here? Okay. So. Right, so money is created through lending, to make a long story short, and every loan comes with interest. So if $1 million is created through a loan, $2 million in debt, say, is created. There's always more debt than there is money. It's systemic. It's a constitutional feature of the system. So this actually, I was thinking about this, when the topic of functional medicine practitioners making less money than doctors who don't do functional medicine, and how can we value ourselves more? I think that it's not just. I mean, there's definitely some of that, because the whole system of value and status gives the most of it to those who are exercising the offices of the story of separation most fully, to the experts. And the cult of the expert is actually part of this story, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, but it's not, so there might be some devaluing of ourselves because we lack certain credentials or whatever, and we might try to overcompensate for that by using biomedical jargon to an excessive degree to show that it's not because we can't handle it or because we're too stupid that we don't participate in the system, et cetera, et cetera. So that there is that, but there's more to it than that, and this is what I've been discovering. What if your patients just can't pay? What if they don't have the money? It's not that you don't value yourself, but you have compassion for the situation that many of them are in, because all of these breakdowns and crises are connected. And when you have a crisis, a medical crisis, the normal person, the old story says, if you get sick, you go to the doctor and the doctor fixes you. And the doctor knows, and science knows, and science is knowing more and more and more. And science and technology are going to create a technological utopia someday, and it's one medical advance after another, and what are they going to think of next, right? That's the story that we are handed. And so, Joe Schmo, is in that story, and goes to the doctor, and the doctor can't fix him, and then he goes to another doctor, and that doctor can't fix him, and another one, and finally one says, our tests aren't showing anything, here's some Prozac, that'll make you feel better. And then finally, he goes to someone and is like, oh yeah, actually you were right all along. You have, lupus, or you have some autoimmune disease that they weren't detecting, and we can't really do anything about it, sorry. And then maybe his, hippie aunt who he never listened to before says, well, you could go to my acupuncturist and go to my naturopath, and then he gets better. Okay, his story is breaking down. His story is disintegrating. And when that story disintegrates, he begins to question everything. He begins to question the rightness of the trajectory of civilization. He begins to question everything in society. He begins to question his job. He begins to question his marriage, his relationships, the way he treats his teenagers. Everything comes under question, and he starts to migrate out of the system. So as functional medicine practitioners, you're going to have a lot of people who are still in the system. And they're in the beginning stages of this creeping radicalization. But you're also going to have a lot of people who they're not participating in the system in multiple ways. And when you don't participate in the system in multiple ways, and you don't contribute to the extractive apparatus of the economy, there's a good chance you're not going to have very much money. And that means that we need another model, which is something that has been coming up again and again, another business model. And the key word here is community. That's been mentioned by quite a few people. Community. And I want to say, actually, like, we talk about community a lot, and the word is bandied about a lot, but I think I'm not sure if we really understand what community is. And the reason we don't understand it is because we don't have it. So community is, the way I think of community, it's a group of people who are bound together by gifts and stories. In a traditional, like, say, a small village, every person in that village owes something to somebody else. Every person in that village has received gifts from somebody else and relies on each other. If you like stop being generous, stop taking care of people and become selfish, then nobody's going to take care of you when you're in need. Gifts create ties, they create connections. If I make a gift to you and you pay me for it, if I give you something, here's I don't know, like, say, Chris, right? Like, say you give me a bottle of some elixir, you know, and like, I don't even know what's in it, but I'm like, hey, he gave it to me, I'm gonna drink it. Is that a good idea? Anyway, so then, like, suppose I'm like, so if I like give you $50, then our transaction is done. You've given me the elixir, I've given you the money, the transaction is complete, and there's no tie left between us. And you might even be insulted if I did that. I'm like, kind of like saying, I don't want to owe you one. I don't want to be bound to you. I don't want to be connected to you. But if you give it to me and, oh, thank you, and I take it and I use it, then if you ask me a favor in the future, if I see you next time, I'm going to be well disposed toward you. Or maybe if I never see you again, I'm going to feel, but we're in a community, I'll be like, yeah, this is a group that takes care of each other. And I know that if I'm generous, I'll be taken care of too. And you'll experience that, being generous and being taken care of too. And you might your wheels might be starting to turn here in the areas of marketing and things like that. So a community is a group of people who are bound together by gifts, who need each other. And that's why a typical suburban neighborhood has no community. You know, you look around, I mean, when I moved back to this country, you know, I wanted to create community, and I looked around my neighborhood, and no matter how many potlucks we had, the fact was nobody needs each other. And if the person next door died and stopped producing whatever he produces, it doesn't affect me because I source everything in my life from remote strangers. Food, shelter, clothing, medicine, entertainment. So a community sources those, at least some of those things, internally from each other. So this business model that's being talked about of a kind of a community of care is aligned with the story of interbeing. Because in a community, your well-being is my well-being. If you are healthy, then you'll be able to give more back to me. If you're or to him, and he gives to her, and he gives to her, and then it comes back to me. The gift travels in circles. So your health is my health. Your good fortune is my good fortune, and your misfortune in, say, you know, a traditional village or a hunter-gatherer community, that's my misfortune too, because your gifts are now no longer available. And we can see ecosystems this way too. Ecosystems, we didn't used to understand this. We used to think that you know, there's some good species and some harmful species, and that humans can improve the world by weeding out the harmful species. We didn't understand that nature too is a gift network. So the understanding of gift and community is a core feature of the story that we're moving into. So I would envision, a community of care where it's not a one-way model of practitioner and patients, but someone was talking about, it has a health coach, it has a physician, it has a whatever. But, have you noticed that especially among patients who have really migrated out of the old normal, that they have a tremendous amount of knowledge. Often they'll come into the doctor and they'll know more about the condition than the doctor will, because it's their condition and they've done huge amounts of research, thanks to some of you in this room, because the information is now available, and they go on to greenmed.info or whatever, and they can do embarrassingly large amounts of research, and maybe some of it's a bit off, and it's not like they can do it alone, but they can do it in community. And so they go to the doctor, and the doctor learns from them also, and then shares experience with them. And so you have a different model of care emerging, which is really a return of medicine to the people. And I think that, we've seen a trajectory of over several centuries of the migration of medicine into the realm of experts and high technology, and therefore high expense, and away from the aunties and grandmothers, the herbalists, who could handle maybe 90% of anything. And then maybe like the other 10% would have to go to the traveling doctor with his black bag, or to the shaman, or to somebody with more expertise. But in general, people were not so helpless. So this is pointing to a reclamation of the other meaning of the word doctor, which is, of course, teacher. A different model of care, which is no longer incentivizes the practitioner to have sick patients, and a return of medicine to the people. A reskilling, which, by the way, is bad for the economy, because that's a lot fewer goods and services that will be sold for money. And I would get into degrowth economics, but I don't think I have time for that. I would like to, I've skipped over a lot of stuff, but I'd like to offer up one more thing here, and then maybe we can have some discussion and questions and things. But here we are in this room. Are we a community here? I would say not yet, but I feel that there's the potential for one. And one more, here's another thing I wanted to mention actually before I get to that. Some of the discussion about what business models work, they take for granted the economic system and the political system and the legal system remaining as it is today. But that's impossible. We are facing a crisis in all of these areas that equals the healthcare crisis in its severity and urgency. And we're going to be seeing, unless you think that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet, we're going to see the collapse of an economic system that depends on infinite growth on a finite planet. And it's the same as that curve from 6% to 18%. Unless you think that can continue forever, which is irrational, unless you think that, that this system has got to change with its addiction to more and more complexity, more and more high-tech responses to problems that from another paradigm, from another story, are actually very simple. So, don't take for granted current conditions persisting for very long. And if you want real security, real economic security, it won't come from money. I'm sorry to say, or I'm happy to say. What would happen if the value of money just disintegrated overnight and your bank account, your investments, your revenue streams all of a sudden became meaningless? Where would you get security then? If you had a community of care, if you were taking care of people And some people who are still in the matrix, they can afford it, they can pay, and others can't. And you find ways to accommodate everybody. And you are in this in service, understanding that your role here is to give of the gifts that have been given to you and standing in confidence that those gifts will recircle back to you. And I'm not saying that this is easy and that there's a formula to do this. That's a whole other topic. But that basic starting point of being in service to, it could be to a community, or it could be to the healing of medicine in this country or on this planet, or it could be to something even bigger than that. But it's the attitude of service. My gifts are available to thee. That stance in a story of interbeing, that's where security comes from. And practically speaking, you will find that when things fall apart, which they will, that the more that you have given, the better off you'll be. Because people will take care of you too.